Again, wishes for a very peaceful and restorative Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom. In The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald famously opined that the very rich are different from you and me. Certainly, what I think has been made abundantly clear during this pandemic is that the poor and less affluent suffer the slings and arrows of misfortune at far higher percentages than most of us. Daily reportage demonstrates that the coronavirus has impacted our low-income communities at many times the rate of affluent neighborhoods. In fact, recent statistics suggest that COVID-19 can be about twice as deadly for those along their society's lower rungs. So rather than supporting the tagline that affirms we are all in this together, the pandemic has vividly revealed the fault line that separates the socio-economically blessed from the less fortunate. Perhaps one of the most jaw-dropping examples to date was in France, where 20,000 have died of COVID-19 and testing is still in short supply. But at the 270-acre Le Parc de Saint-Tropez, a private billionaire's compound, tests are available for everyone thanks to Le Parc's own coronavirus testing center established by its association president, a wealthy pharmacist turned entrepreneur who owns several clinics and laboratories in the south of France. As long as you don't live outside the gates, you can get a test. This week's episode, the double Torah portion of Acharei Mot Kedoshim, shows that it too is concerned that wealth and access to resources too often tip the scales of justice in surrounding societies. In Leviticus chapter 19, found in the second of the weekly portions, Kedoshim, the Ten Commandments are essentially repeated and expanded upon, but with a specific emphasis on justice and equity, the Hebrew word tzedek, for those less fortunate. We read, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not pick your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. You shall not defraud your fellow. You shall not commit robbery. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning. You shall not insult the deaf, nor place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall not render an unfair decision, neither favor the poor nor show deference to the rich. Judge your kin fairly." In Hebrew, b'tzedek tishpot amitecha. "Do not deal basely with members of your people. Do not profit by the blood of your fellow. You shall rise before the aged and show deference to the old. And when a migrant," what we used to translate as sojourner or stranger, "when a migrant resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong them. The migrant who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love them as yourself, for you were migrants in the land of Egypt. You shall not falsify measures of length, weight, or capacity. You shall have just scales," honest scales, "moznei tzedek," just weights, honest weights, avnei tzedek, a just dry measure, ephod tzedek, and a just liquid measure, hin tzedek. I, the eternal, am your God who freed you from the land of Egypt. In fact, the very notion given in the name of the weekly Torah portion, Kedoshim, the very notion of holiness we associate with this episode, comes in its very first verse, where we are told, "Kedoshim tihiyu, ki kadosh ani Adonai." We are told that the people of Israel shall be holy, Kedoshim, because God's self is holy, Kadosh. Now, too often people associate the idea of holy with either holier than thou, hypocritical behavior, often from people in the religious community, or holiness as a spiritual affect of unique seekers and searchers, but not something for regular everyday folk. But, in fact, the weekly episode makes it quite clear that Kodesh, holiness, is synonymous with the English verb to distinguish. Our covenant with God asks that we distinguish ourselves even as God is distinguished as the Creator from all creation. And how are we mere mortals to do so? Well, by our behaviors, of course. We are to distinguish ourselves as a people by what we do and how we behave, by our commitment to acting with tzedek, with justice and equity. Sometimes being committed to holiness as Jews asks us to stand apart from the behaviors that are going on around us. That's certainly what this week's Torah portion had in mind for our ancestors when they came to Canaan. In that sense, kadosh can mean that we separate ourselves from others, but that is not its primary intention. To stand apart can be figurative and not always literal. To stand apart can also mean to stand out. That is what holiness asks of us, to stand out, or as the Torah expects of us, to be an outstanding people. One of my teachers liked to offer this jestful observation. What does it mean to be acclaimed a person outstanding in one's field? In the best version, there is no space between out and standing. You are the person in the midst of many who stands out by one's choices and deeds. On the other hand, you can be that person with the space between out and standing. Literally out there in the field, standing alone and by yourself, which is a lonely and unsupported place. Today we are called upon to do both, to stand out, to continue our people's covenant and dedication to tzedek, to justice and equity for all, even as we are asked, at least temporarily, to stand apart from one another. Let this time, when we must stand apart, also be a time in which we can demonstrate that we as a people also stand out in our commitment to justice and equity for all, and especially in our commitment to those who are less fortunate and with fewer blessings than our own. Kain Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will and our choice and our deed. As always, I am privileged to share my thoughts from this vantage point on the bima, on the pulpit, and I invite you to share your responses and reactions and thoughts. Please send me an email. I won't get to it until after Shabbat, of course, but I do try to respond to them, and I really appreciate. I've been receiving responses every week so far, and it's nice to know that people are being attentive and being engaged by the words that I am offering. So thank you. We are going to offer